Good afternoon. Today we're going to talk about socioecological models and biopsychosocial and models of health. So just a little bit of background. In 1972, Belloc and Breslow studied the relationship between healthy status and some practices. And what they found is that there were some specific behaviors that, when practiced by individuals, resulted in better health status. The individual behaviors that they found were sleeping, this is for adults, okay? Sleeping between 7 and 8 hours per night, no or very low alcoholic consumption, like a drink a day or less, being physically active, eating breakfast, keeping a healthy weight, not smoking, and not eating between meals. As we can see here, I put this example of Homer Simpson because in a way he kind of exemplifies the behaviors perhaps that Belloc and Breslow recommended that we avoid to have a healthy life. So then there were the development of a couple other models. One of them is called the biomedical model. States that humans were kind of like a machine. We work like a machine that, if a car breaks down, we can just fix it, fix the broken parts, and it'll work. So in the same way, humans were just made up of tissues, which are made, organs, which are made up of tissues, which are made up of et cetera, and down to the molecular level. And if we can just fix the parts that are broken and fix that down to the molecular level, then we should be able to fix, to cure disease. So for the biomedical model, disease is sort of a discrete condition that deviates significantly from the norm and that causes distress and pain to the individual. So in this case, however, there are some critiques, and I'll talk about it in a bit. So you may remember, for example, commercials for antidepressants referring to depression as a chemical imbalance, right? And how they say that the chemical imbalance can be corrected by the antidepressant, and therefore there can be sort of a cure. So based on the biomedical model, mental disorders can be just like biological disorders, and they're caused by biological abnormalities, as I mentioned, by a chemical imbalance. There is no meaningful distinction between mental illness and physical diseases. And then, therefore, it can be treated via external forces. So in this case, for example, they like to equate depression with, like I mentioned, diabetes. For example, diabetes can be cured with not cured, but treated with a medication or taking insulin. In a similar way, we can do with mental disorders, or so the biomedical model professes. Give me a second.
You know when you feel the weight.
Okay, So now I'm going to show you.
You know when you feel the weight of sadness. You may feel exhausted, hopeless, and anxious. Whatever you do, you feel lonely and don't enjoy the things you once loved. Things just don't feel like they used to. These are some symptoms of depression, a serious medical condition affecting over 20 million Americans. While the cause is unknown, depression may be related to an imbalance of natural chemicals between nerve cells in the brain. Prescription Zoloft works to correct this imbalance. You just shouldn't have to feel this way anymore. Only your doctor can diagnose depression. Zoloft is not for everyone. People taking MAOIs or Pemazide shouldn't take Zoloft. Side effects may include dry mouth, insomnia, sexual side effects, diarrhea, nausea, and sleepiness. Zoloft is not habit forming. Talk to your doctor about Zoloft, the #1 prescribed brand of its kind. Zoloft. When you know more about what's wrong, you can help make it right. You know.
All right, so that is an example of how the biomedical model has guided not only people's beliefs about health and disease, but it has kind of driven, I think, a whole cultural shift into focusing on taking this type of interventions and considering disease, all forms of diseases to be just biologically based. And in fact, when some diseases cannot be biologically based, when there's no biological reasoning behind them, then therefore they're not diseases, they're not pathological, and they're not to be treated by medicine. And so I'd like to give you the example of sometimes there's not really a test. Is there really like a laboratory test we can take for depression, anxiety? I mean, there are some tests that we can do, but like, for example, a thyroid exam and so forth. But these can only get at indirect causes, tap into some of the causes of these disorders, but sometimes there's not really um, one specific test that can tell us conclusively that a person has a mental disorder and why the person has this mental disorder, and even more so, what is the mechanism of how we can correct it. So thus arise the biopsychosocial model, in which we're not just taking into account the biological aspects of our human life, but we're also considering the psychological and the sociological components. So this kind of expands our view about, again, the not just causes of diseases, but also processes and therefore treatments. So let me give you another example. So actually there was a study, there's been a couple of studies, I think the reviews that just came out in the news recently. I don't know if you saw them, where they talk about that this old hypothesis of the serotonin imbalance causing depression has sort of been debunked, as if all the research shows that um, depression does not, it's not seem to be directly caused by this imbalance, and that not only that, but that the antidepressants don't exactly work in that way. So what this tells us is that antidepressants can work for some people. It's just we don't know exactly how they work, and that this old hypothesis of chemical imbalance may not be exactly right. Um, and this may even expand to other disorders, as the article, Engel's article, the need for a new medical model states when it comes to schizophrenia and so forth. Now we have another study that talks about, um, that says that nature nurtures. Amygdala activity decreases as the result of a 1-hour walk in nature. So the amygdala, what the amygdala does is that It is the neural system for processing fearful and threatening stimuli. So it seems that our amygdala appears to be more activated when we are in urban environments. That means when we live in built environments created by human, and they seem to be better or lower when we are um, surrounded by nature. There has been some correlation that show that mental problems like anxiety, mood disorders like bipolar disorder, major depression, and schizophrenia tend to be up to 56% more common for people who live in urban environment as opposed to rural environments. So there seems to be some sort of connection here um, with people and our environment. So it's not just this chemical imbalance that happens that is separate from our social world and our physical world. We have here, for example, it says this news: rates of teen suicide attempts drops when states legalized same-sex marriage. So what that tells us is that, again, depression is not merely a chemical imbalance, but it can be affected by our social conditions. In this case, it appears that for LGBTQ young people, when they may experience some hostility toward their communities, they are more likely to feel depressed, and as a return, uh, may of course, everybody who suffers from depression tends to be at risk for suicide. So when we change the societal conditions under which we live to be more optimal for everybody, we can see that improvements in mental health. So it can go both ways. Um, so therefore, we see that we are affected by um, our social and physical environments. And so this is where we get into the socio-ecological models. So again, in the past, uh, researchers have been focused more on individual focused theories, and so there was a shift to move more towards social focused theories. Um, we want to look at the interrelationship between various factors and not just look at the intrapersonal factors. This also helps us avoid victim blaming. So as I mentioned in the past, there's a lot of research that, for example, says that diseases are caused by specific individual risk factors. You know, for example, smoking, right? And so, so we can say something like, instead of what socioecological models allow us to do is to say, okay, instead of just blaming the smoker, we need to understand the reasons surrounding this person as to why some people are more likely to take up smoking than others. And so we start to look at that and see that the environment also can, certain places can heighten the risk of young people starting to smoke, for example. So we need to avoid blaming the victim and start looking at the reasons behind them to try to make the environments more optimal for them to live. So let's say when some places tend to be more supportive of healthy practices, we see that in fact um, there are positive changes, and this is in regards to obesity, secondhand smoking, as well as other sedentary behaviors. I mentioned to you about Homer Simpson, how he's maybe not the best example of healthy behaviors, and he kind of practices a lot of risky behaviors. But I want you now to think about Homer Simpson. He is not alone and separate from everything. Homer Simpson actually has a family, so he is affected by a family and affects his family. He lives in a community where he works, and at work he's actually exposed to radiation, I believe. Um, he also is an active member of the community. His family maybe sometimes goes to church and his children's schools. And ultimately, he's part of this city that has a government that has some policies implemented. So here we have the example about the fishing, right? That is the um, lake is contaminated, I believe. So this tells us that we not only need to like look at Homer Simpson, like blame Homer Simpson, but actually look at the conditions around his living. So here we came to one of the most well-known socioecological models, which is McLeroy's ecological model of behavior. And what he does is he look at the different levels. It's a conceptual framework that he presents, and he look at the different what are called levels of influence. And we begin by intrapersonal factors. So those are the characteristics of the individual, such as their knowledge, attitudes, behavior, concept of the selves and skills, etc. The second one is interpersonal processes and primary groups. So this refers to, some social network and social support system. Again, that could be the family, work group, and friendship networks. Then we have the institutional factors. So those are the social institution with organizational characteristics and formal and informal rules and regulations for operation. So this could be, again, like work, for example. Then we have community factors, so relationships among organizations, institutions, and informal networks within defined boundaries. And last but not least, we have the public policy. So this could be at the local, state, or national laws and policies. And I'll give you examples in a while. Then we have the Estocal's socioecological model. So this Estocal's model is kind of similar to McLeroy's in some ways, but it talks about environments being multidimensional, as well as different levels of human interaction. What I find interesting about Estocal's socioecological model is that it considers that there's reciprocity between people and the setting. So not only are we people affected by our environment, but we in turn can affect the environment. So you can think about, for example, the appearance and maintenance of farmer market, for example. So maybe in the beginning, there's some interest by some people to start a farmer's market in their community, and then one pops up. But then maybe over time, there might or might not be interest in the people in that neighborhood to show up to the farmer's market. So whether that farmer markets continues depends on whether people actually show up to support the farmers. So in this way, we can see that there is an interaction between people and our environment. It's not just one way, it's not just the environment affecting us, like whether we have been facilitated with healthy alternatives, but also how we humans can affect the environment, can affect that availability of healthy alternatives. Now we discuss Deborah Cohen's structural ecological model. So Deborah Cohen's is a little bit different. She has different categories of structural factors, and what she considered one of the main premises for her is that when we are doing individual level interventions, that means interventions where we are targeting mainly people as individuals, one by one. What we are doing is um, is that, as we see here on this bell curve of people, we are only reaching to some people, to a few people, and we see that in this curve how people may be responding to a specific situation, right? Um, so what she premised was that when we do this, we are only reaching a very slim number of people, and we're not really changing the structures around which we live that can actually change our um, how do you say, ease our lifestyles or help us promote healthier lifestyles. And so what she premised was that when we have structural level interventions, we're actually shifting the curve for not just a few people, but for everybody in that community. And by that, what I mean is, what she mean was four categories. One, availability of protective or harmful consumer products. So she talks about whether there are protective or harmful consumer products. So whether, for example, um, we find cigarettes and alcohol very available in our neighborhood, as well as fast food restaurants, or we have protective consumer products. Again, farmers market, healthier produce, and so forth. Second category is physical structures of or physical characteristics of products. So what she's saying is that um, the physical structures or the characteristics of products can be appealing to some people, and those may be, again, unhealthy as well as um, healthy. So we need to study um, the conditions, right, under which this can happen. And then we have social structures and policies. So here we look at, again, policies that require or prohibit behaviors, social structures that set guidelines to limit high-risk behavior and provide a framework for encouraging low-risk behavior, as well as enforcement that assists people in complying with those rules and regulations. So this can be government or non-governmental. So it could be anywhere from individual to group. And I'll give you an example in a little bit. And the fourth one is media and cultural messages, how we are affected or sometimes bombarded by what the media says and cultural messages that may be healthy, promoting, or not. So there are some principles of ecological perspectives that, again, cross all socioecological models. And one of them, it says there are multiple levels of influence of health behaviors. So these are what we call the levels of influence that I just described earlier. So there's not just one level of influence. Oftentimes, when we are looking at the other behavior theories that you'll be learning about in this semester, they tend to focus only on one level, like individual, social, community, policy. And so what the ecological model perspective say is that actually we are affected by sometimes all levels of influence, from family to school or work to policies. Um, then it says environmental contexts are significant determinants of health behavior, which we already discussed why. Then we have influences of behavior interact across levels. So they're not, all these levels of influence are not exclusive of each other, but there is interaction across this level. Think about, policies affecting schools. And again, I mentioned family affecting the individuals and so forth. For ecological models to be working better, they need to be behavior specific. So if you say just in general, oh, we want it to be to lower obesity, I mean, that's too generic, right? So it works better when the behavior is very specific, when we're saying, okay, we want to lower the availability of the intake of sugary beverages for children. So there we can focus at all these levels, from the individual, from the intrapersonal, all the way to the policy level, or vice versa. um, and in that case we are more successful. Okay, so your goal should be very specific. A multi-level intervention should be most effective in changing behavior. So again, because there's interaction across levels, we should be considering the intervention to be more than one level. And these are some examples of how we the sort of public health methods that we can use at each of the um, levels of influence. Now, let me give you an activity. Please identify the levels of influence for each of the following activities. So, number one, warning labels on sugar-loaded drinks. Number two, soda and junk food taxes. Number three, private breastfeeding classes. Number four, a moratorium on fast food restaurants in your community or in your neighborhood. Number five, a mass media campaign on flu vaccination. Number six, prescribing the male birth control pill. Number seven, an Alcoholics Anonymous support group. And number eight, employer incentives to join a gym. Okay, so practice identifying the levels of influence so you can tell them apart. The strengths of socioecological models is that you can reach a large number of people. It can be more comprehensive for complex health issues. So usually, for example, if we just want people to be screened for breast cancer, I mean that's a more simple behaviors that we're asking people to do. It's still a lot of work, of course, to get women to get screened for breast cancer, but you can see how it's relatively easier, it's more direct to do than to change a children's level percentile of BMI. Okay, so it can be better for some complex health issues that have more of an influence from the environment. You can affect multiple levels of influence, and policy can sustain those behavior changes. The limitations is that because there are more variables involved, it can be more difficult to evaluate outcomes. It can be more difficult to know, okay, which activity had the most effect on the behavior outcome. Okay, was it the policy? Was it the school program? Was it the family intervention? So we need to be able to identify which were the most important factors so that we can, focus on those and maybe improve the others. We may need to combine this model with other theories. So let's say we're doing an individual intervention, then we sometimes borrow constructs from individual theories and so forth. It can be less intensive than an individual level. So this is the caveat. Let's say that for example, an obesity intervention, we have money to hire a nutritionist who can give personal lessons to 200 families in a year, for example. So she can spend a lot more time per family guiding them through their diet. Okay, so an individual, sometimes a smaller individual level intervention can have a bigger impact than some socioecological intervention that is not as intense. And then some variables cannot be manipulated by researchers. So we are not like controlling the city. We do not control the government. We do not control all of the variables. So sometimes we are only able to work on those variables that we can change. So let me give you an example. And I'm going to use my work that I did on this project with exposure to secondhand smoke. You might know that there are health consequences for secondhand smoke. And what secondhand smoke is when we breathe the smoke that another smoker is exhaling. So the second person is not the smoker. However, we breathe the smoke from the smoker. 1 in 4 non-smokers is actually exposed to a secondhand smoke. The rate of exposure is very high in multi-unit housing. It's about 1 in every 3rd. And people who live in low-income housing tend to, or in places that don't have policies or that the policies are not really enforced against smoking in the premises, tend to have a higher rates of exposure, and as a result, health problems. So there can be individual level approaches, and by this would mean educating, right? Sending people, sharing with people some educational materials to tell them about the consequences of secondhand and third-hand smoke. Then we can have some cultural, family, cultural, or social community level of interventions having to do with, for example, culture. So there are different main cultural characteristics of Hispanics as well as Anglos or European Americans. So, for example, for Hispanics, the family, there's a greater value placed in family that includes extended family. So in this case, for Hispanics, a good intervention against smoking could be explaining to Hispanics that when they smoke, they're actually affecting their family. That it's not just the smoker, but actually he's maybe affecting the partner, the children, and so forth. So this is a culturally tailored intervention. For European Americans, for example, they might like more their individualism. So maybe the intervention may be more targeted towards their individual ideas, as well as maybe, as it says, high internal locus of control, giving them some ways in which they can have control over the situation, right? Giving them some resources, or telling them about their options of where they can smoke or they shouldn't smoke, so that way they feel like they're in control. And then we have again, community factors. So these can be geographical factors. This is a study that I conducted in it was in Los Angeles County, and we have the green dots are the multi-unit housing properties that were sampled for the study. And we see that there tends to be a pattern where there are more multi-unit housing properties in the more densely populated areas. So what we're seeing is there can be, just because there are more people crowded in some space, the likelihood that people will be exposed to smoke are higher in those places. So then we want to do maybe a community intervention at this level, where we target the places that are more crowded. And then we get to the policy level. So there's been some studies that show that as there has been more policies against smoking, the rate of tobacco smoking has actually decreased over the years, and it's maybe at its lowest point ever. However, However, unfortunately, we have had the increase in smoking via electronic devices. Those are like the vaping, for example, as well as the legalization of marijuana, recreational marijuana that poses kind of a threat to clean air policies. But anyway, in this case, we hope that the rules on these electronic devices, as well as recreational marijuana smoking, can follow along the rules that we have set forth for um, smoking tobacco. We see here that there is a policy. The policy can be at the building level, like the owner of the building can have that policy, or the manager, um, maybe because it's more expensive for them to fix houses when people are, when their tenants are smokers, or the policy can be at the city or state level. So in this case, we see that there is a policy by the South Pasadena, the city of South Pasadena, no smoking within 25 feet. And then we see that I actually took a picture of these cigarette butts that were I found just within a few feet from this sign. So just because there is a policy, it's not necessarily true that the law will be enforced. I saw here, for example, in the city of Glendale, I see this sign that Glendale had a policy against smoking. We see that the sign is up in the property, and I didn't smell any cigarette smoke. And over here on to the right, we see that there was another city in LA County that I visited, and that city didn't have no smoking policies in the apartment buildings, but the manager tried to put a sign that said no smoking. She was actually pregnant when I spoke to her, and she said, I keep putting the sign, but some people, the smokers, keep taking it down. Interestingly, she said, they've never taken the no parking sign down. And I thought that was interesting because if they take the no parking sign and they park there, they can get a ticket, right, by the police. So to me, that let me know, okay, maybe there's something to do with them knowing that some policies being enforced um, that affects whether they follow uh, what the manager is saying. So sometimes we study the situation and we find it's not just some key player like the manager uh, of the building, but there's an interplay again with other levels of influence like policy at the government level. I saw this sign in LA where we see this billboard that says marijuana delivered for your enjoyment. So this website is saying they will deliver marijuana to the people's houses. Um, and so if you see this billboard, um, it is illegal actually to have such billboards to advertise tobacco cigarettes. But we didn't have such laws against recreational marijuana. So that's where these as well as some vaping products were being advertised. And so um, we need the rules that apply to them as well, because they can affect the children's development and children's and everybody's health, just like tobacco smoking. Here's an example of, as I mentioned, Cohen's socioecological approach. And I made this graph. I'm really proud of this graphic. Um, that shows how, like I mentioned, all of these four levels, the availability of protective or harmful consumer products. So whether these products are available, like vaping and marijuana in people's communities, the physical structures or the physical characteristics of products. In this case, for example, it is not legal to have tobacco smoking products be appealing to children. In fact, they have to follow certain guidelines and they have to have a warning. In some countries, even the the container box, the cigarette container box, have to be brown, have to be a very unappealing color. So they cannot have certain brands to be attractive to the consumer. So what I'm seeing is that, as you see here, for some products like vaping and marijuana, eh, the companies are wanting to appeal to a certain population of young children and young adults uh, with the characteristics of the products to be, as we see, more for children, like with candy flavors or inside of candy. And so we need also to look into if this affects the children's uptake of these unhealthy behaviors. And then we have social structures and policies and media and cultural messages, right? So the same way, whether we are being affected, if, for example, um, people maybe might be have been hearing a lot about medicinal marijuana. So actually, a lot of people tend to be confused, and they think that marijuana is good because it's medicinal, when in fact some components of marijuana can be medicinal under certain conditions, and those tend to be for some patients. But recreational marijuana is different. And again, it can have long term, when consumed by children, um, or smoked by everybody, can have long term damages, the same or sometimes even worse than tobacco smoking. So, Cohen socioecological approach is one way in which we can target, address some of these different issues having to do again with tobacco smoking or the new vape and recreational marijuana smoking. We can also think, for example, policies how, again, like some stores are not allowed to sell cigarettes or alcohol when they are close by a school. But such rules were not in place when marijuana was legalized in some states, and therefore, some marijuana dispensaries were open in places that were within, some 100 feet of schools. And so now we need to look at this situation. Um, we need to backtrack. So this is where um, I support the regularization of marijuana instead of the legalization of marijuana, because we need to think ahead of these issues and not be behind when it comes to policy and trying to catch up. By the time we do so, there is already a population of people that have been affected. And in this case, if it's children, young adults, and once they become addicted to some of these substances, it can be life for life. Uh, and this can also be passed down to their friends or children. So what we like to do with these socioecological models is to investigate how and which variables interact and result in some specific models. We need to build models with multi-level data to test how interaction predict these empirical outcomes. So here I present to you, I carried out, like I mentioned, some study having to do with secondhand smoking, and it was with apartment managers as well as tenants. And what I resulted in creating this model from the apartment managers that says, well, there seems to be some ambiguity of rules reported by both managers and tenants, and that they need to be addressed. They can be addressed at the government level and at the landlord level. That means changing policy. So at the policy level by both the government and the landlord, which can then create some uniform rules that can then be enforced by the building, by the on-site manager. At which points then we can carry out some tenant education with some educational materials, so that they can reinforce their policies being enacted. So I'd like you to think about how you would implement these models, particularly McElroy's model, to target critical health problems. So these are some of the problems that we have, such as fast food, high fat intake, sugary drink consumption, violence, whether it be just in general or a specific form of violence, recreational marijuana smoking, increasing breastfeeding, as well as decreasing loneliness. We have an epidemic of loneliness in the United States. And this causes many problems, including depression, anxiety, and early death. Long-term loneliness has have the same result in mortality as smoking 15 cigarettes a day. So how would you use these models to increase social connectedness among all people, young and old? Um, these are my bibliography. So I hope this was helpful for you to process the information from the um, the readings assigned. And as always, please let us know if you have any questions.